Just as Michael tried to get into his car, a police cruiser screeched to a halt beside him. Two officers jumped out, their eyes cold and suspicious. They interrogated him without explanation, treating him like a criminal. When they finally apologized, it was too late. He knew moments like this, where no one listens, could happen again. What happens next? It was a sweltering afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made the air feel thick. Michael, a 32-year-old black man with a quiet composure and a faint, knowing smile, made his way to his car. His thoughts were simple. He was focused on a client meeting, already running late, and then he had to rush to pick up his daughter. The rhythm of his day was a familiar one, but as he reached his car, a sharp screech of tires pierced the air. The sudden sound made him pause, his focus snapped away from his routine. A police cruiser slid to a stop beside him. Two officers jumped out, their movements abrupt. One of them, Officer Johnson, called out in a voice that didn't leave room for a response. "Hey, you there! Step aside!" Michael's body tensed. His instincts, honed by years of experience in situations like this, kicked in. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just trying to get in his car and go. He had all his papers, his ID, his work documents, but the officers didn't give him the chance to explain. The command was sharp and immediate. "Where are your papers?" Officer Johnson asked, his eyes not meeting Michael's but scanning him, sizing him up as though he were guilty of something. The second officer, Williams, stayed a few steps behind, scanning the street, his posture rigid as if Michael might suddenly become a threat. Michael stood still, his mind racing as he quickly assessed his options, but he remained calm, deliberately slow as he reached for his wallet. His hands didn't shake, but his pulse quickened. He handed over his ID, and for a moment, neither officer spoke. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. Suspicion hung thick in the air, and Michael's chest tightened as he waited for the next words. But nothing came, just the tension, like they were waiting for something to happen. Michael could feel it, the heaviness of being judged without ever having had the chance to explain. His heart beat louder now, but he didn't show it. He couldn't. The officers studied Michael's ID for a moment, their eyes shifting between the card and his face. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence before they exchanged glances, subtle but loaded with meaning. The confident, commanding air they'd had just moments before seemed to fade, replaced by an uncertainty that was almost palpable. "Are you sure this is you?" Officer Johnson asked, his voice lower now, a trace of suspicion still hanging in the air. "How can we know you're not impersonating someone?" The question hit Michael like a slap. For a second, he felt his heart drop. Then a wave of anger surged within him. But he fought to keep it in check. Anger wouldn't solve this. He was used to being questioned, to having his existence doubted simply because of the color of his skin. But today, something about this felt different. Less like a routine stop and more like an attempt to undermine him, to assert control over him for reasons that weren't clear. He swallowed the fire rising inside him and forced his voice to stay even, calm. "This is my ID, officer. I'm just trying to get on with my day," he said, keeping his gaze steady. The officers didn't respond right away. They continued to eye the ID with renewed scrutiny, like it was somehow suspect just because it was in his hands. It felt absurd, but Michael had long learned to not show the anger boiling beneath the surface. His fingers tightened around the leather of his wallet, but his posture remained relaxed, defensive, but not aggressive. For a moment, Officer Williams broke the tension, looking over at Johnson. There was no word, no signal, but his movement said enough. He stepped back, as though the question had been answered in a way that unsettled both of them. Their confidence was gone. The authority they had assumed in their first moments with him had cracked, leaving behind doubt, silent and awkward, but very much present. Michael could sense it. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now hesitated. They had planted the seed of uncertainty, but neither of them knew how to handle it. Now, it was them who were left exposed. For what seemed like an eternity, the officers stood there, still holding Michael's ID between them. The heat of the afternoon hung thick in the air, but inside him, the tension was worse, like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Frustration and fear swirled together, each pulse of his heart a reminder of the helplessness he'd felt moments ago. But he controlled it, forced himself to stay composed. He'd been through this before. His thoughts raced, but his outward appearance remained calm. Finally, after what felt like an excruciatingly long pause, Officer Johnson spoke. His voice was softer this time, less confident, almost hesitant. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, the words dragging out awkwardly, like they didn't belong. "We thought you were someone else." The apology landed flat, hollow in its delivery, but Michael's eyes narrowed as he listened. It wasn't an apology for the harm caused, but for the mistake. A mistake that had put him on edge, had stolen his peace of mind. Officer Williams, standing slightly behind his partner, added in a quieter tone, "We got a report about a suspect matching your description. It was a mistake. Our mistake. A mistake." The words hung in the air like a slap. Michael's stomach churned. They had almost ruined his entire day, his carefully scheduled routine, his work, the meeting he had planned, even his sense of safety. Everything had been thrown into chaos in an instant. He stared at the officers, taking in the unease on their faces. Officer Johnson shifted uncomfortably, as though the apology wasn't just for the inconvenience caused, but for the realization that things had escalated unnecessarily. But even now, Michael could feel it. Their discomfort was not truly for him. It was for their own discomfort in having to face the mistake. "You shouldn't be stopping people without reason," Michael said, his voice steady but sharp, the calmness masking the anger still simmering under the surface. "People like me get harassed for nothing. You should know that." Officer Johnson nodded slowly, the guilt in his eyes apparent. But there was something more, an unsettling lack of true understanding. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. Michael could see it in the way the officer looked at him, guilty but still unsure, still distant. As Michael finally walked away, his frustration slowly morphed into a quiet anger. He had been stopped, questioned, and treated like a criminal, despite being nothing more than a man going about his day. The officers might have apologized, but it didn't undo the harm. It didn't undo the fear he had felt in that moment. Michael sat in his car, staring at the rearview mirror, reflecting on how easily his life could have taken a turn. He was tired of the excuses, tired of the apologies. He wanted change, not apologies. But for now, he drove off, knowing that this moment wouldn't be the last of its kind. It would happen again. As the car sped off, the city buzzed around him, unaware, indifferent. But Michael was no longer the same. He had been forced to face something brutal, something that left him with more questions than answers. What would he do next? What could he do? The road ahead was uncertain, but Michael was no longer a man who would ignore the injustice, no longer someone who would stay quiet. He knew that change didn't come from silence.